Ooh. Okay. Hi. Hi, everybody. We're going to pick up tonight with the plague. We're in part 2, in the middle of it. I'm in the living room again. This is the couch department. There's a dog here with me. That's Lulu. It was her birthday. We're gonna pick up where I left off. Where we heard about Grant's book that he's writing. And, he's written one sentence. Here's where we're picking up. Part 2. Others, too, Rambert, for example, were trying to escape from this atmosphere of growing panic, but with more skill and persistence, if not with greater success. For while Rambert had gone on struggling with officialdom, if he was to be believed, he had always thought that perseverance would win through, inevitably, and as he pointed out, resourcefulness in emergency was up his street, in a manner of speaking. So he plodded away, calling on all sorts of officials and others whose influence would have had weight in normal conditions. But as things were, such influence was unavailing. For the most part, they were men with well-defined and sound ideas on everything concerning exports, banking, the fruit or wine trade, men of proven ability handling problems related to insurance, ill-drawn contracts, and the like, high qualifications and evident good intentions. That, in fact, was what struck one most, the excellence of their intentions. Going crazy being stuck inside. But as regards plague, their competence was nil. However, whenever opportunity arose, Rambert had tackled each of them and pleaded his cause. The gist of his argument was always the same, that he was a stranger to our town, and being so, his case deserved special consideration. Excuse the background noise. Phil is petting the cat, and she's incredibly squeaky. Where was I? Oh, so whenever opportunity arose, Rambert had tackled each of them and pleaded his cause. The gist of his argument was always the same, that he was a stranger to our town, and being so, his case deserved special consideration. Mostly the men he talked to conceded this point readily enough, but usually they added that a good number of people were in a like case, and so his position was not exceptional. To this, Rambert could reply that this did not affect his argument in any way. He was told then that it did affect the position, already difficult, of the authorities, who were against showing any favoritism and thus running the risk of creating what they called a precedent. In conversation with Dr. Rieu, Rambert classified the people who he had approached in various categories. Those who used the arguments mentioned above he called sticklers. Beside these there were consolers, who assured him that the present state of things couldn't possibly last, and when he asked for definite suggestions would fob him off by telling him he was making too much fuss about a passing inconvenience of quarantine. Then there were the very important persons who asked every visitor to leave a brief note of his case and informed him they would decide on it in due course. Triflers who offered him balleting warrants, or gave him the address of new lodgings, red tape merchants, who made him fill out a form and promptly entered it in a file, overworked officials who raised their arms to heaven, and much harassed officials who simply looked away from him, and finally, the traditionalists. Those were by far the greatest number. They referred Rambert to another office, or recommended a different method of approach. All of these fruitless interviews had worn out the journalist. On the credit side, he had obtained insight into the inner workings of the municipal offices and a prefect's headquarters, by dint of sitting for hours on imitation leather sofas, confronted by posters urging him to invest in savings bonds exempt from income tax, or to enlist in a colonial army, and by dint of entering offices where human faces were as blank as the filing cabinets, and the dusty records on the shelves behind them. The only thing gained by all of this energy, Rambert told Ryu, with a hint of bitterness, was that it served to keep his mind off of his predicament. In fact, the rapid progress of the plague practically escaped his notice. Also, it made the days pass more quickly, and given the situation in which the whole town was placed, it might be said that every day lived through brought everyone, provided they survived, 24 hours closer to the end of the ordeal. Ryu could but admit the truth of this reasoning, but to his mind its truth was of a rather too general order. At one moment, Rambert had a gleam of hope. A form was sent to him from the prefect's office with instructions that he should carefully fill in all the blanks. It included questions concerning his identity, his family, his present and former source of income. In fact, it was his curriculum vitae. He got the impression that inquiries were on foot with view to drawing up a list of people who might be instructed to leave town and return to their homes. Some vague information gleaned from an employee in one of the offices confirmed this impression. But on going further into the matter and finally discovering the office from which the form had come, he was told that this information was being collected with a view to certain contingencies. What contingencies? He asked. He then learned that the contingency was the possibility of his dying of the plague while in town. The data he supplied would enable authorities to notify his family and his colleagues and to decide if hospital expenses should be paid by the town itself or if they should be recovered from his relations. On the face of it, this implied he was not completely cut off from the woman who was awaiting his return, since the powers that be were obviously giving heed to both of them. But that was no consolation. The remarkable thing that Rambert was greatly struck by was the way in which, in the very midst of catastrophe, offices could go on functioning serenely and take initiatives of no relevance, and often unknown to the highest authority, purely and simply because they had been created originally for this purpose. The next phase was at once the easiest and the hardest for Rambert. It was a period of sheer lethargy. He had gone the round of offices, taken every step he could take, and realized that for the present all avenues of that kind were closed to him. So now he drifted aimlessly from cafe to cafe. In the mornings he would sit on the terrace of one of them and read a newspaper, in hopes of finding some indication that the epidemic was waning. He would gaze at the faces of passers-by, often turning away disgustedly from their look of unrelieved gloom, and after reading for the nth time the shop signs on the other side of the street, the advertisements for popular drinks that were no longer buyable, he would rise and walk again at random in the yellow streets. Thus he killed time until nightfall, moving about the town and stopping now and then at a cafe or restaurant. One evening, Ryu noticed him hovering around the door of a cafe, unable to make up his mind whether to enter. At last he decided to go in and sat down at a table at the back of the room. It was the time when, acting under orders, cafe proprietors deferred as long as possible turning on the lights. Gray dusk seeped into the room, the pink of sunset in the wall mirrors, and the marble-topped tables glimmered white in the gathering darkness. Sitting in this empty cafe, Rambert looked pathetic and lost, a shade among shadows, and Ryu guessed that this was the hour when he felt most derelict. It was indeed the hour of day when all the prisoners of the town realized their dereliction, and each was thinking that something, no matter what, must be done to hasten their deliverance. Ryu turned hurriedly away. Rambert also spent a certain amount of time at the railroad station. No one was allowed on the platforms, but the waiting room, which could be entered from outside, remained open, and being cool and dark, was often patronized by beggars on the very hot days. Rambert spent much time studying timetables, reading the prohibitions against spitting, and the passengers' regulations. After that he would sit down in a corner. An old cast-iron stove, which had been stone-cold for months, rose like a sort of landmark in the middle of the room, surrounded by figure-of-8 patterns on the floor, the trace rings of long past sprinklings. Posters on the wall invited tourists to carefree holidays at Cannes or Bandol, and in his corner Rambert savored that bitter sense of freedom which comes of total deprivation. The evocations which at that time he found most touching were, according to what he told Ryu, the posters of Paris. There rose before his eyes, unsummoned, vistas of old stones and riverbanks, pigeons, the Gare du Nord, quiet streets around the Pantheon, and many other scenes of the city he'd never known he loved so much. These mental pictures killed all desire for any form of action. Ryu felt fairly sure he was identifying these scenes with memories of his loved one. And when one day Rambert told him that he liked waking up at 4 a.m. and thinking of Paris, the doctor guessed easily enough, based on his own experience, that that was his favorite time for conjuring up visions of the woman from whom he was now parted. This was, indeed, the hour when he could be most sure that she was wholly his. Until 4 a.m. one is seldom doing anything, and at that hour, even if the night has been a night of betrayal, one is asleep. Everyone sleeps at that hour, and this is reassuring, since the great longing of an unquiet heart is to possess constantly and consciously the loved one, or failing that, to be able to plunge the loved one, when a time of absence intervenes, into a dreamless sleep, timed to last unbroken until the day they meet again. Next section. Shortly after Father Panelou's sermon, the hot weather set in with a vengeance. On the day following the unseasonable downpour of that Sunday, summer blazed out above the rooftops. First a strong, scorching wind blew steadily for a whole day, drying up the walls, and then the sun took charge. Incessant waves of heat and light swept the town day long, and but for arcaded streets and the interiors of houses, everything lay naked to the dazzling aspect of the light. The sun stalked the townspeople on every byway, into every nook, and when they paused, it struck. Since this first onslaught of heat synchronized with a startling increase in the number of victims, there were now nearly 700 deaths a week. A mood of profound discouragement settled on the town. In the suburbs, little was left of the animation between the long, flat streets and the terraced houses. Ordinarily, people living in those districts used to spend the best part of the day on their doorstep, but now every door was shut. Nobody was to be seen, and even the blinds stayed down. There was no knowing if it was the heat or the plague that they were trying to shut out. In some houses, groans could be heard. At first, when that happened, people often gathered outside and listened, prompted by curiosity or compassion. But under the prolonged strain, it seemed that hearts had toughened. People beside those groans lived or walked past them as though they had become the normal speech of men. As a result of fighting at the gates, in the course of which the police had had to use their revolvers, a spirit of lawlessness was abroad. Some had certainly been wounded in these brushes with the police, but in the town, where, owing to the combined influences of heat and terror, everything was exaggerated, there was talk of deaths. One thing, anyhow, was certain. Discontent was on the increase, and fearing worse to come, local officials debated lengthily on the measures to be taken if the populace, goaded to frenzy by the epidemic, got completely out of hand. The newspapers published new regulations reiterating the orders against attempting to leave the town, gathering in large groups, and warning those who infringed them that they were liable to long terms of imprisonment. A system of patrols was instituted, and often, in the empty, sweltering streets, heralded by a clatter of horse hoofs on the cobbles, a detachment of mounted police would make its way between the parallel lines of closed windows. Once in a while, a gunshot could be heard, the special brigade recently detailed to destroy cats and dogs, as potential carriers of an infection. And these whip-crack sounds startled the silence and increased the nervous tension already existing in the town. For the heat and stillness, and for the troubled hearts of our townsfolk, anything, even the least sound, had a heightened significance. The varying aspects of the sky, the smells rising from the soil that mark the change of season, were taken notice of for the first time. Everyone realized with dismay that hot favor would favor the epidemic, and it was clear that the summer was beginning. The cries of swifts in the evening air above the housetops was growing shriller, and the sky too had lost the spaciousness of the early June twilights, when our horizon seemed infinitely remote. In the markets, the flowers no longer came budded. They were already in full bloom, and after the morning's marketing, the dusty pavements were littered with trampled petals. It was plain to see that spring had spent itself, lavished its ardor on the myriads of flowers that were bursting everywhere into bloom, and was now being crushed out by the twofold onslaught of heat and plague. For our fellow citizens, the summer sky, and the streets thick in dust, gray as their present lives, had the same ominous import as the 100 deaths weighing daily upon the town. The incessant sunlight and the bright hours associated with siesta or holidays no longer invited to frolics and flirtation on the beaches. But now they rang hollow in the silence of the closed town. They had lost the golden spell of happier summers. Plague had killed all colors and vetoed all pleasures. That indeed was the greatest change brought by the epidemic. Until now, all of us welcomed summer with pleasant anticipation. The town was open to the sea, and the young people made free of the beaches. But this summer, for all its closeness, the sea was out of bounds. Young people no longer had the run of its delights. What could we do under these conditions? It is Theroux once again who paints the most faithful picture of our life in those days. Needless to say, he outlines the progress of the plague, and notes that a new phase of the epidemic was ushered in when the radio announced no longer weekly totals, 92, 107, or 137 deaths in a day. The newspapers and authorities are playing ball with this plague. They fancy they're scoring off it because 130 sounds smaller than 910. He also records such striking or moving incidences of the epidemic as came under his notice. For instance, of a woman in a lonely street who abruptly opened a shuttered window just above his head and shrieked twice loudly before closing the shutters again on the dark interior of a bedroom. He also noted that peppermint lozenges had vanished from drugstores because there was a popular belief spreading that when suckling on them you were proof against contagion. He went on watching his pet specimen on the opposite balcony. It seemed that his tragedy had come to the ancient small game hunter as well. One morning there were gunshots in the street, and Theroux said some gobs of lead had killed off most of the cats and scared away the others. Anyhow, they were no longer around. That day, the little old man went to his balcony at the usual hour, seemed surprised, and leaning on the rail, closely scanned the corners of the street. Then he settled down to wait, tapping the balustrade with his right hand. After staying there for some time, he tore up some paper, went back to his room, and came out again. He waited another time, then retreated into the room, slamming the French blinds behind him. He followed this same procedure daily during the rest of the week, and the sadness and bewilderment on the old man's face deepened as the days went by. On the 8th day, Theroux waited in vain for him to appear. The windows stayed closed. This entry ends with Theroux's summing up. It is now forbidden to spit on cats during the plague. In another context, Theroux notes that, on coming home in the evenings, he invariably saw the night watchman pacing the hall like a sentry on a beat. The man never failed to remind everyone that he'd foreseen what was happening. Theroux agreed that he had predicted a disaster, but reminded him that he had predicted an earthquake. To which the old man replied, "If it had only been an earthquake, a good bad shock, and there you are. You count the dead and the living, and it's over. That's an end to it. But this damned disease, even those who don't have it can't think of anything else." The manager of the hotel was equally downhearted. In the early days, travelers, unable to leave the town, had kept their rooms. But one by one, seeing that the epidemic showed no signs of abating, they had moved out to stay with friends, and the same cause that had led to all the rooms being occupied now kept them empty, since there were no newcomers to the town. Theroux was one of the very few remaining guests, and the manager never lost an opportunity of informing him that, Were he not reluctant to put these gentlemen to inconvenience, he would have closed the hotel. He often asked Tarrou to say how long he thought the epidemic would last. They say, Tarrou informed him, that cold weather stamps out diseases of this type. The manager looked aghast. But it's never really cold in these parts, and that would mean it's going to last months. Moreover, he was sure that for a long while to come travelers would give the town a wide berth. This epidemic spelt the ruin of the tourist trade, in fact. This is The Plague by Albert Camus. After a short absence, M. Oton, the owlish paterfamilias, made a reappearance in the restaurant, but accompanied only by the 2 performing poodles, his offspring. On inquiry, it came out that Madame Oton was in quarantine. She had been nursing her mother who had succumbed to the plague. I don't like it a bit, the manager told Tarrou. Quarantine or not, they're under suspicion, which means that they are too. Tarrou pointed out that if it came to that, everyone in the entire town was under suspicion. But the manager had his own ideas and was not to be shaken out of them. No, sir, you and I are not under suspicion, but they certainly are. However, Mr. Oton was impervious to such considerations and would not let the plague change his habits. He entered the restaurant with his wonted dignity, sat down in front of his children, and addressed to them at intervals the same nicely worded, unamiable remarks. Only the small boy looked somewhat different, dressed in black like his sister, a little more shrunken than before, and now his face looked like a miniature replica of his father's. The night watchman had said of him, "That fine gentleman will pass out with his clothes on, dressed up and ready to go. He won't need any laying out." Tarrou has some comments on the sermon preached by Father Panelou. I can understand this type of fervor and find it not displeasing. At the beginning of a pestilence, and when it ends, there's always a propensity for rhetoric. In the first case, habits have not yet been lost, and in the second, they're returning. In the thick of a calamity, one gets hardened to the truth, and there is silence. So let's wait. Tarrou also records that he had a long talk with Dr. Rieu. All he remembers is that it had good results. In this connection, he notes the color of Madame Rieu's, the doctor's mother's, eyes, a soft brown, and makes the odd observation that a gaze revealing so much goodness of heart would always triumph. He has a good deal to say about Rieu's asthma patient. He went with the doctor to see this patient immediately after their conversation. Hold on a second. Hey guys, I'm reading. I've got dudes in the house. Quarantine. He went with the doctor to see his asthma patient immediately after their conversation. The old man greeted Tarrou with a chuckle and rubbed his hands cheerfully. He was sitting up in bed with the usual 2 pans of dried peas in front of him. "Here's another one," he said when he saw Tarrou. "It's topsy-turvy, all right, more doctors than patients. Because it's mowing them down, ain't it, more and more. That priest's right. We were asking for it." The next day, Tarrou came to see him alone without warning. And from his notes we gather that the old man, a dry goods dealer by occupation, had decided at the age of 50 that he had done enough work for his lifetime. He took to his bed and never left it again, but not because of asthma, which would not have prevented his getting about. A small fixed income had seen him through to his present age, 75, and the years had not dampened his cheerfulness. He couldn't bear the sight of a clock, and indeed there was none in the entire house. Watches, he said, are silly gadgets and dear at that. He worked out the time, that is to say, the time between meals, with his 2 saucepans, one of which was full of peas when he woke in the morning. He filled the other, dried pea by pea, at a constant, carefully regulated speed. Thus, time was reckoned for him by these pans, and he could take his bearings in it by any moment of the day. Every 15 pans, he said, it's feeding time. What could be simpler? If his wife was to be trusted, he had given signs of this vocation at a very early age. Nothing had ever interested him. His work, friendship, cafes, music, women, outings, to all of this he was indifferent. He had never left his hometown except once when he had been called to Algiers for family affairs, and even then he had left the train at the first station after Oran, incapable of continuing the adventure. He took the very next train back. To Tarrou, who had shown surprise at the secluded life he led, he gave the following explanation. According to religion, the first half of man's life is upgrade and the second downhill. On the descending days, he has no claim. They may be snatched from him at any moment. So he can do nothing with them, and the best thing, precisely, would be to do nothing with them. He obviously had no compunction about contradicting himself, because a few minutes later he told Tarrou that God didn't even exist, since otherwise there would be no need for priests. But from some observations which followed, Tarrou realized that the old fellow's philosophy was closely involved with the irritation caused by the house-to-house collections in aid of charity, which took place almost incessantly in this part of the town. What completed the picture of the old man was a desire he expressed several times, and which seemed very deeply rooted, the desire to die at a very advanced age. Is he a saint? Tarrou asked himself, and answered, well, if saintliness is an aggregate of habits. In the meantime, Tarrou was compiling a longest description of a day in the plague-stricken town, trying to give a full and accurate picture of the life of the citizens during that summer. Nobody laughs, Tarrou observes, except the drunks, and they laugh too much. After which begins the description. At daybreak, the air fans the empty streets. At this hour, between the night's victims and the death agonies of the coming day, it is as if, for a while, plague holds its hands back and takes a breath. All stores are closed. On some, a notice, shut owing to plague, shows that when the others open presently, these will not. Still half asleep, the newsboys do not yet cry out the news, but sit at street corners and offer their wares to the lamp posts with vague gestures like sleepwalkers. Soon, awakened by the early streetcars, they fan out through the town, holding at arm's length sheets on which the word plague looms large. Will there be a plague autumn? Professor B says no. Toll on day 94, 124 deaths. In spite of the growing shortage of paper, which has compelled some dailies to reduce their pages, a new paper has been launched, the Plague Chronicle, which sets out to inform the townspeople of the daily progress or recession of this disease. This newspaper very soon came to devote its columns solely to advertisements of new, unproven, infallible antidotes against the plague. Toward 6 a.m, all these papers are being sold, to the lines that begin to form outside the stores over an hour before they open, and to the passengers lighting from the streetcars coming in, packed to capacity from the suburbs. These cars are now the only means of transport, and have much difficulty progressing. People are standing on the running boards and hanging in clusters from the handrails. Also, the passengers try to keep their backs turned to their neighbors, twisting themselves into grotesque attitudes in the attempt, the idea being, of course, to avoid contagion from each other's breath. At every stop, a cataract of men and women is disgorged, everyone in a haste to put a safe distance between himself or herself and the rest. When the first cars have gone by, the town gradually wakes. Early cafes open their doors, and you see an array of cards on the counter saying, "No coffee," or "Bring your own sugar." Then the stores open and the streets grow lively. Meanwhile, the light is swelling, and the sky is beginning to grow leaden-hued with heat. This is the time when those who have nothing to do venture to the boulevards. Most of them seem determined to counteract the plague with a lavish display of luxury. Around 11, you see a sort of dress parade of youths and girls, which makes you realize the frantic desire for life that thrives in the heart of every great calamity. If the epidemic spreads, morals will begin to broaden, and we may see again the Saturnalia of Milan, men and women dancing round the graves, and more. At noon, in a flash, all the restaurants fill. Small groups of people unable to find a seat will form at the doors. Because of the heat, the sky is losing its brightness. The aspirants to food wait their turn, aligned along the curbs of streets, gaping and sizzling in the fire of noon. The reason for the restaurant being crowded is that they solve for many the problem of a lack of food. But they do nothing to stop the fear of contagion. Most customers spend their time methodically wiping down their plates, forks, and knives. Not long ago, some restaurants put up notices. Plates, forks, and knives are guaranteed sterilized. But gradually they discontinued publicizing this, since the customers came anyway. However, people continued to spend very freely. Choice wines, or wines alleged to be such, the costliest extras. A mood of reckless extravagance is setting in. It seems something like a panic in a restaurant because something happened and a customer suddenly fell ill, went very white, and staggered to the door. The entire restaurant emptied, allowing a whole new set of people to come and seat themselves. Around 2 o'clock, the town slowly empties. This is the time when silence, sunlight, and plague have the streets to themselves. Wave after wave of heat flows over the frontage of the gray houses during these long hours, and the afternoon wears on, merging into an evening that settles like a red sheet on the serried tumult of the town. At the start of the great heat, for some uncertain reason, the evenings found the streets almost empty. But now the least ripple of cool air brings an easing of the strain, possibly a flutter of hope. Everyone streams into the open, drugging themselves with talking, conversation, arguing, love-making, and in the last glow of sunset of the town, freighted with lovers, 2 by 2, loud with voices, the town drifts like a helmless ship into the throbbing darkness. In vain, a zealous evangelist with a felt hat and a flowing tie walks through the crowd, crying, "God is great and good." On the contrary, they all make haste toward a trivial objective, something of more immediate interest than God's. In the early days, when they thought the epidemic was like any other epidemic, religion definitely held its ground. But once people realized their instant and immediate peril, they gave their thoughts merely to pleasure. And all the hideous fears that stamp their faces in the daytime are transformed in the dusty nightfall into a sort of hectic exaltation, an unkept freedom fevering their blood. And I'm no different. But what matter? Death means nothing to men like me. In fact, death is the event that proves me right. That's a section. And we'll stop there for the night because I slept all day. I slept yesterday and today I slept all day. I'm a night walker right now, so this is kind of like morning time to me. Phil is very sweet. He was grumbling around. I'm sure you heard him grumbling and bumbling around. He was making me some morning coffee. I'm going to do some painting. I've got a couple of big sheets started. Yeah, thank you guys. I try to read the comments as I go, and it's sort of hard. Yeah, everybody's going crazy being stuck inside, man. This is I mean, like, it's one thing to read about historical plagues, the bubonic plague, especially because people didn't self-quarantine. It was a societal, regional quarantines. But there have been outbreaks of things like the pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague is airborne. It affects your lungs. So it's got similarities. That has got similarities with coronavirus, with what we've got going on now. And in those cases, I think maybe when I finish this book, we're about 2/3 the way through. But when we get to the finish of this, I might read some of Plague Time in London, which is about the pneumonic plague. And there's also a Chinese book I have a translation of about the pneumonic plague in, I think, Shanghai. So I might read sections of those because it's a little more accurate. People hiding in their houses, starving in their houses out of fear of the plague, breathing in the plague, which is kind of where we're headed now. I mean, I remember the AIDS crisis. And I remember just before they kind of knew how it was transmitted. And I remember people just being afraid to be near each other. And it has a real similar feeling, except, of course, this is affecting everybody, so people give a shit about it this time. Anyway, we'll pick up next time with the doctor talking to Taru, the person who's been keeping that journal, and with the uptick in deaths, which is, we're about to launch into the desperate and crazy part of this book. Good luck, everyone. Stay home. Stay safe. Don't go out. If you have to go out, best of luck. Wear a mask. Cover your face. Eat well. Try to get some sleep. And I'll talk to you tomorrow.